Hello, this is Alan Zek. As there is an increased trend of getting education through internet, I felt the need to spread my knowledge by using this media. Today I deliver the lecture on psychology of evil. Choosing this topic specifically means with an increasing research on the terrorism and its consequences. Um, as far as I'm concerned about it, I think that it's very important to understand the psychology of evil. Until and unless if we don't consider it, uh, we cannot say this that we will be succeeded in removing the trend of terrorism, or you can say that in removing the consequences of terrorism. So it's very important, and it's also an important aspect of forensic psychology. As Dostoevsky said that nothing is easier than to denounce evildoer, nothing more difficult than understanding him. Yes, it is very difficult to understand the psychology of evil because you cannot say that what are the social and the psychological processes which lead him to demean or dehumanize any other person using his authority. If we start from the history of evil, we know that it starts when Allah's favorite angel, until he challenged Allah's authority, was cast into hell with all other fallen angels. And we have created different myths of evil conspiracies and come to believe them to enough mobilize forces against them. So basically Allah made hell to store evil in it. Yes, this is an MC Astro illusion, and I just put this slide to basically describe this illusion to you, that some would see that angels in it, some would see demons in this illustration. The line between good and evil is permeable, and almost anyone can be induced to cross it when pressured by the situational forces. So we can say that anyone can do or perform an evil act because the line between good and evil is permeable and movable. I have told you the history of evil, that how it started. Now the question is that what is basically evil? It is defined as that it is an intentional behavior that harms, abuse, or dehumanize any other person using his authority. In short, you can say that it knows better but doing worse. So now this question arises that when someone faced with unusual behavior or unexpected event, the question always begins in these scenarios with who, in spite of what. The traditional approach has been to identify the inherent personal qualities that lead to the action, genetic makeup, personality traits, character, free will, and the dispositions. All these things are mainly the traditional focus when people or a system face the unusual behavior or the unexpected event. Like for example, in the US, a rash of shootings in which high school students murder and wound scores of other students and teachers rock suburban communities. In England, a pair of 10-year-old boys kidnapped 2-year-old Jamie Burglar from a shopping center and brutally murders him in cold blood. And we are seeing all these evil effects, or you can say that in Palestine and Iraq, Syria, young men and women are becoming the victims of bombs. And in Pakistan during the APS terrorist attacks, the attack in Charsada University, then the recent attacks in Seven Sharif, and then all these are basically the evil acts, and in these evil acts number of children or number of people are murdered by Taliban. The question is why is it happening all? So normally, I have told you before that in these situations, who questions are the focus. Who is responsible, who caused it, who gets the blame, and who gets the credit. But according to social psychologist Philip Zimbardo, preference to what questions should be given. What conditions should be contributed to certain reactions, because it's necessary that what circumstances might be involved in generating behaviors. Social processes are much more relevant in that type of situations, because Alexander said that this thin line between good and evil is in the center of every human heart, and this thin line is movable and permeable, which lead to the transformation of human character in some circumstances which he or she normally wouldn't. Now, as a psychologist, that how they view these human transformations, and what are the type of aspects are going on in their mind when they are thinking about these transformations. So basically, there are three aspects on which they consider the human transformations basically. First of all is the dispositional characteristic. And I think every human being should know about this, that what are these type of basic forces which force any person to behave or perform unexpectedly, or you can say that abnormally, in a situation like in a situation where he cannot perform in a normal thing. And the dispositional perspective is basically, it is the inside of individuals and follows the medical model. Now, what is the medical model? A medical model tries to find the source of illness, disease, or disability within the affected person. This is basically the traditional approach. Like, for example, in dispositional approach, a child who exhibits a learning disability may be given a variety of medical and behavioral treatments to overcome that handicap. Then there's another second perspective, that is situational, and we can say it as barrel makers. Now, barrel makers are basically the external forces which are responsible for evil acts. Situational forces are assumed to be little more than a set of minimally relevant extrinsic circumstances. Extrinsic circumstances are basically the external circumstances, but in many cases, especially among the poor, the problem is caused by ingesting lead in paint that flakes off the walls of tenement apartments and is worsened by the conditions of poverty. Like, I wanted to through this example, I wanted to explain this, that there was a patient who ingested lead in a paint, and after all there were some disastrous effects, and these effects are then worsened by the by his poverty, and poverty is basically an external factor. The situation approach encourages all to share a profound sense of humility when we are trying to understand the unthinkable, unimaginable, senseless acts of evil, violence, vandalism, suicidal terrorism, torture, rape. Situational approach gives others the benefit of attribution charity. Now then, there's a third approach, which is basically the systematic, or we can say it as bad barrel makers, the one who create a situation. Basically, bad barrel makers are the power systems who exert pervasive top-down dominance. Means power residing in systems started within awareness of institutions who create mechanisms that translate ideology. Or you can say that dispositions and situations must be taken into, say, the causes of evil into operating procedures, such as the Inquisition's witch hunts. In more simplified form, I just wanted to say that it includes political, economic, and legal systems, which are the makers of evil. The ways in which situational conditions are created and shaped by the higher order factors, systems of power. Systems, not just dispositions and situations, must be taken into account in order to understand the complex and unthinkable behavior patterns. Now, aberrant, illegal, or immoral behavior by individuals in service professions, such as policemen, correctional officers, and soldiers, is typically labeled the misdeeds of a few bad apples. Like the implication of these systematic or bad barrel makers lie that they are a rare exception and must be set on one side of the impermeable line between evil and good, with majority of good apples set on the other side. But who is making this distinction? Usually it is the guardians of the system who want to isolate the problem in order to deflect attention and blame away from those at the top who may be responsible for creating an untenable working conditions or for lack of oversight or supervision. So when we go for system analysis, it basically focuses on the barrel makers, on those with the power to design the barrel, or you can say that to design that system. It is the power elite, the barrel makers, often working behind the scenes, who arrange many of the conditions of the life for the rest of us, who must spend time in the variety of institution settings they have constructed. So, to understand that how we acknowledge, or you can say that explain all these processes, I have selected some experiments which will basically gives you a brief overview of human psychology. There's a very famous experiment, that was the Stanford Prison Experiment, who basically describes that in the system, or you can say that in an experiment where some students were selected and these students were placed in a simulated experiment, and in these experiments some students were chosen as guards and some were chosen as prisoners, and then they studied the prison. Stanford studied the effects of that simulation and revealed a very surprisingly human nature. In August 1971, social psychologist Philip Zimbardo performed an infamous experiment at Stanford University, one whose results still send a shudder down the spine because of what they reveal about the dark side of human nature. In Stanford prison experiment, nice middle-class young men turned sadistic. That was the basic result of that experiment. I will show you the pictures that as the project was designing experiment that randomly assigned normal, healthy, intelligent college students to enact the roles of either guards or prisoners in a realistically simulated prison setting, where they were to live and work for several weeks, and gives the understanding of the dynamics operating in the psychology of imprisonment. That the basic questions were that how do ordinary people adapt to such an institution setting? How do the power differentials between the guards and the prisoners play out in their daily life interactions? And would the violence that is endemic to most real prisons be absent in a prison filled with good middle-class boys? And you will see the answers in these pictures. This prisoner is forced to seeing these pictures, that these prisoners, what are these prisoners doing in these pictures? The guards were just humiliating the prisoners, and now then there's some depression in Stanford prisoners. The conclusions of the findings of that prison experiment was that It was ended after 6 days because these were the depression was reported higher in the prisoners because they were humiliated or dehumanized by the guards. There were dramatic changes in virtually every aspect of their behavior, thinking and feeling. And the guards were treating the prisoners as despicable animals, and they were taking pleasures in their authority. Here's another thing which will make you more surprising, because these results were found practically in form of horrific images of abuse at Abu Ghraib. I will show you the slides that how these military persons are humiliating the prisoners. Horrific images of abuse at Abu Ghraib was revealed in May 2004. The vivid images of young American men and women you are seeing in these slides, that they engaged in unimaginable forms of torture against civilians. They were supposed to be guarding in prison. The tormentors and the tormented were captured in an extensive display of digitally documented depravity that the soldiers themselves had made during their violent escapades. The images are of punching, slapping, then kicking detainees, jumping on their feet, forcibly arranging naked, hooded prisoners in piles and pyramids, dragging a prisoner around with a leash tied to his neck, and using unmuzzled attack dogs to frighten prisoners. And when this unrevealed, the media and the person in the street around the globe asked how such evil deeds could be perpetrated by these 7 men and women whom military leaders had labeled as rogue soldiers and a few bad apples. Well, according to my view, the focus should be worse circumstances in that prison cell block, which could have tipped the balance and led even good soldiers to do such bad things. Now I'll come to the real term that for which I make this whole lecture, that how good people turn into evil. That Lucifer effect was basically described by a psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, who explains through this effect that how the systematic changes turn the good people into evil. Lucifer effect is basically describes the point in time when an ordinary normal person first crosses the boundary between good and evil to engage in an evil action. It represents a transformation of human character that is significant in its consequences, like kind, cruel, caring or indifference, villain or hero, etc. Now, again the question is that why situations matter. Situations matter because it is a truism in psychology that personality and situations interact to generate behavior. People are always acting within various behavioral contexts. More often than not, we are active agents capable of influencing the course of events that our lives take, and also of shaping our destinies. Moreover, human behavior and human societies are greatly affected by the fundamental biological mechanisms as well as by the cultural values and practices. The individual is the coin of operating realm in virtually all of the major institutions of medicine, education, law, religion, and psychiatry. These institutions collectively help create the myth that individuals are always in control of their behavior, act from free will and rational choice, and are thus personally responsible for any and all of their actions. But contrary to that, we want to believe in the essential unchanging goodness of people and their power to resist external pressures. The Stanford Prison Experiment or the Abu Ghraib the horrific images at Abu Ghraib prison revealed, or gives a clarion call to abandon simplistic notions of the good self dominating bad situations. We are best able to avoid, challenge, and change negative situational forces only by recognizing their potential to infect us, as they have others who were similarly situated. This lesson should have been taught repeatedly by the behavioral transformations of Nazi concentration camp guards and by the genocide and atrocities committed in Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Burundi, and Sudan's Darfur region. Any deed that any human being has ever committed, however horrible, is possible for any of us under the right circumstances. I am saying it again, under the right circumstances. That knowledge doesn't excuse evil, it democratizes it, sharing its blame among ordinary actors, rather than declaring it in the province of deviants and despots, of them but not us. So now the coming point is that how social processes help in the slippery greasing of evil. What are the social processes or on which the human psychology goes through and delve into that evil will? There are some points that mindlessly taking first small step, dehumanization of self, de-individuation of others, uncritical conformity to group norms, blind obedience to authority, passive tolerance of evil through inaction or indifference. Now, going for an explanation of the first point, that is anonymity and de-individuation. As the line best describes, that feelings dominate reason and action dominates reflection. The enduring interest in the Stanford prison experiment over many decades comes at a real transformation of character, of good people suddenly becoming perpetrators of evil as guards or pathologically passive as prisoners in response to situational forces acting on them. Situational forces mount in power with the introduction of uniforms, costumes, and masks, all disguises of one's usual appearance that promote anonymity and reduce personal accountability. We know that when people feel anonymous in a situation, and we know that if no one is aware of their true identity, they can more easily be induced to behave in antisocial ways. When all members of a group are in a de-individuated state, their mental function changes. They live in an expanded present moment that makes past and future distant and irrelevant. And the usual cognitive and motivational processes that steer behavior in socially desirable paths no longer guide people. It becomes as easy to make war as to make love without considering the consequences. At Abu Ghraib, one of the guard named Chip Frederick recalls that it was clear that there was no accountability. So it became the norm for the guards to stop wearing their full military uniforms while on duty, and all around them most visitors and the civilian interrogators came and went unnamed. No one in charge was readily identifiable, and seemingly endless mass of prisoners wearing orange jumpsuits or totally naked were also indistinguishable from one another. And it was as extreme a setting for creating de-individuation as I can imagine. So basically, de-individuation is the indistinguishability. Like you cannot differentiate one person to another. The other is, what is dehumanization? Dehumanization is basically occurred by their sheer numbers, enforced nakedness, uniform appearance, as well as by the guards' inability to understand their language. There's another night shift guard, Ken Davis, reported that how dehumanization had been bred into their thinking. As soon as we would have prisoners come in, sandbags instantly on their head. We have seen in the previous slides that there were some prisoners who have sandbags on their head. They would flexi come cuff him, throw him down to the ground, some would be stripped. So it was told to all of us that they are nothing but dogs. You start looking at these people as less than human, and you start doing things to them that you would never dream of. That was the terrible statement made by one of the guard. The Stanford Prison experiment relied on de-individuating silver reflecting sunglasses for the guards along with standard military style uniforms. Now I'm comparing the Abu Ghraib prison with the Stanford Prison experiment. The power the guards assumed each time they donned these uniforms was masked by the powerlessness the prisoners felt in their wrinkled smocks. So obviously, Abu Ghraib prisons was a far more lethal environment than a relatively benign prison at Stanford. However, in both cases, the worst abuses occurred during the night shift, when guards felt that the authorities noticed them least. It is reminiscent of Golding's Lord of the Flies, where supervising grown-ups were absent as the masked marauders created havoc. Now, the third point basically explains the human nature, the blind obedience to authority. Well, this point actually reminds me of the Milgram experiment, in which it was stated that if a person in a position of authority ordered you to deliver a 400-volt electric shock to another person, would you follow orders? Well, when this question was asked to the people, the answer was no. But when psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of obedience experiments during the 1960s, that led to some surprising results. And these experiments offer a compelling and disturbing look at the power of authority and obedience. The participants in the most famous variation of the Milgram experiment were 40 men recruiting using newspaper ads. I'm just telling you the details of that experiment so you will get the clear idea and understand the concept. In exchange for their participation, each person was paid $4.50, and Milgram developed an intimidating shock generator with shock levels starting at 30 volts and increasing in 15 volt increments all the way up to 450 volts. We are seeing in this that this is the 15 volt and then there is the 450 volts. Milgram basically quantified the evil in form of obedience to authority. So all evil start from that 15 volts, and the many switches were labeled by terms: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock. Then there's a dangerous severe shock too. And each participant took the role of a teacher who would then deliver a shock to the student every time an incorrect answer was given. While the participant believed he was delivering real shocks to the student was basically a confederate, the one who was just acting that he was experiencing a shock delivered by the teacher. He was not really experiencing that shock, that was just a simulating experiment. The student was a confederate and who was simply pretending to be shocked. The measure of the obedience was the level of the shock that participant was willing to deliver. And how far do you think that the most participants were willing to go? When Milgram poses questions to a group of students, it was predicted that no more than 3 out of 100 participants would deliver the maximum shock. And in reality, you can see that 65% of the people, the participants in Milgram's study, delivered the maximum shocks. Ordinary people who simply do their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. And the Milgram proved this through the experiment. Then there's such the Sanger report, and there's a Fair report who basically describe the Lucifer effect that why individuals and groups usually act humanly can sometimes act otherwise in certain circumstances. Fair report also described this, that the environment created in Abu Ghraib by the leadership failure contributed to the occurrence of such abuse. So fact is remained undiscovered by the higher authorities yet, until yet. Now, the conclusion. To conclude this, I just wanted to say that a system of criminal legal justice over relies on common sense views held by the general public about what things cause people to commit crimes. Usually only motivational and personality determines. The workings of the criminal justice should not continue to be guided by illusions about cross-situational consistency in behavior, by erroneous notions about the impact of dispositions versus situations in guiding behavior, or by failures to think through the logic of person by situation, interactions, or even comforting but largely fanciful notions of free will, any more than it should be guided by one's common notions about witchcraft or demonic possession. It is time for the system to take into account the substantial body of evidence via behavioral sciences about the power of the social context, that how it is contributing and influencing the behavior, criminal actions, as well as the moral ones. So that's all for today. Thank you for viewing my lecture. Please like my video, give your valuable feedback in comment section, and if you didn't understand any of the thing, please feel free to ask questions in the comment section, and subscribe my channel. So I will upload my videos in coming days, which will give you more practical elaboration of the psychological concepts which you can relate in your life too. Goodbye.